I still remember the smell before I remember what I saw: fresh dirt, diesel fuel, and something else that didn't belong in my backyard, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up before I even stepped out of my truck. My wife, Linda, looked over at me with that little smile she'd been wearing ever since our grandson's smashed birthday cake all over his own face an hour earlier. But the second she followed my eyes toward the fence, that smile disappeared. There wasn't any water reflecting the afternoon sun anymore. There wasn't the sound of the waterfall I'd spent 18 years listening to every single morning with a cup of coffee in my hand. There wasn't even a flash of orange from my oldest koi, Samson, who had somehow survived raccoons, freezing winters, and one tornado warning. Instead, there was a mountain of packed fill dirt, fresh gravel spread across the top, like someone was trying to hide a crime scene, and stuck right in the middle of it was a laminated notice from the Homeowners Association fluttering in the breeze. Unauthorized water feature removed. That's all it said. 6 words that buried 18 years of my life. I don't mind admitting it. I stood there for nearly 5 minutes without saying a word. Linda squeezed my arm, but neither of us knew what to say because what do you call something like that? Vandalism, arrogance, stupidity, all three. That pond wasn't some fancy landscaping project I paid contractors to build. I dug every inch of it myself, one shovel at a time, every Saturday and every Sunday back when my knees still worked better than they do now. I'd hauled rock from creek beds, learned filtration systems from old pond builders, planted lilies that came back stronger every spring, and raised koi that recognized me well enough to swim into my hand whenever I leaned over the edge. My granddaughter used to call it Grandpa's magic water because butterflies always seemed to show up there first every summer. Birds nested nearby because they knew fresh water would always be there. Dragonflies hovered over the lilies. Frogs sang after dark. It wasn't just a pond. It was the heartbeat of our backyard. The funny thing is, the HOA never appreciated anything that couldn't be measured with a ruler or painted beige. The board president, whose name was Carl Whitmore after I changed every name in this story because those people don't deserve free publicity, had been after me for almost 3 years. Every monthly meeting, he'd wave another complaint around like he'd uncovered some national security threat. Standing water attracts mosquitoes, he'd announce, adjusting his expensive reading glasses while people nodded because nobody wanted to argue with the loudest man in the room. I'd calmly explain that properly balanced ponds actually reduce mosquitoes because fish eat the larvae and moving water prevents breeding, but facts were never Carl's favorite hobby. Uniformity was. If your lawn looked exactly like everyone else's, if your mailbox matched every other mailbox, if your flower bed stayed inside invisible little boxes, then life made sense to Carl. Nature never fit inside his boxes. The notices started small. Trim this shrub, repaint that fence, move those decorative stones. Then they became personal. Remove pond accessories. Reduce water feature visibility. Submit engineering approval. Every letter sounded like it had been written by someone who had never planted a seed in their life. I'd complied when requests were reasonable and politely challenged the ones that weren't. That apparently offended Carl more than outright rebellion because people like him don't just want obedience, they want surrender. The neighborhood landscaping contractor later told me, after everything exploded, that Carl had approached him 2 weeks earlier asking how much it would cost to reclaim an unauthorized excavation. The contractor assumed there was a court order or county permit involved. There wasn't. On the day Linda and I drove 2 hours away to celebrate our grandson turning 1, Carl unlocked my side gate using the HOA emergency access key that was supposed to exist only for fires or burst water mains. He brought in 2 skid steers, 3 dump trucks loaded with filled dirt, and a crew that worked nearly 6 straight hours burying my pond under hundreds of tons of soil. They crushed pumps, filters, piping, waterfalls. Everything disappeared beneath that dirt. I later learned one of the workers actually asked whether anyone had confirmed the fish were removed first. Carl reportedly shrugged and said, "They're just fish." Maybe to him they were. To me they were 18 years of mornings, quiet conversations with Linda, birthday photos, grandchildren laughing while tossing pellets into the water, and a reminder that patience creates beautiful things. I reached down and picked up the laminated violation notice, brushed dirt off the corner, read it one more time, then looked back across that enormous pile of fresh soil. Linda whispered, "What are we going to do?" I didn't answer right away because something had just clicked in the back of my mind. Something Carl had never bothered asking before he declared war on my backyard. You see, everyone in the neighborhood believed my pond was decorative because that's all they ever saw. What they never knew, what Carl never bothered learning, was that my little backyard paradise had quietly been doing another job for almost 2 decades, one that kept every basement on our street dry every time spring storms rolled across the county. And as I looked at all that dirt covering 18 years of careful engineering, I realized they hadn't just buried my pond. They'd buried the only thing standing between 42 expensive homes and thousands of gallons of storm water, with nowhere left to go. For a few minutes, I just stood there staring at that pile of dirt while memories kept coming faster than anger. The first shovelful I'd dug 18 years earlier. The weekends my son helped me haul boulders into place before his own back started bothering him. The afternoon little Emma, my granddaughter, accidentally named every koi in the pond, even though she couldn't remember the names of half her classmates. It would have been easy to explode, to march straight to Carl Whitmore's front door and scream loud enough for the whole subdivision to hear. But I knew something he didn't, and sometimes the strongest move isn't the loudest one. It's the quiet one that lets reality do all the talking. I walked into my garage, opened an old filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder labeled Drainage Easement and Retention Improvements. Linda watched me spread yellowing engineering drawings across the workbench, then slowly looked back toward the backyard. "You still have all of it?" she asked. I smiled for the first time that day. I keep everything. Years before the subdivision was finished, our property had been the lowest point on that entire hillside. The original developer discovered during county review that the municipal storm system couldn't handle runoff from the planned neighborhood during heavy rain events. Instead of building a massive concrete retention basin in the common area, which would have cost a fortune and reduced the number of homes they could sell, they negotiated with the previous owner of my property. The agreement allowed an underground drainage network to discharge excess stormwater into what was then a natural depression on our land. When Linda and I bought the place, I transformed that depression into the koi pond, but I never interrupted its real purpose. Beneath the rocks, lilies, waterfalls, and crystal clear water sat oversized drainage chambers and controlled overflow piping that slowly released stormwater back into the municipal system after every storm. In other words, my pond looked beautiful because I wanted it to, but it also happened to be solving a civil engineering problem for 42 families who never even realized it existed. Carl had never asked. The HOA board had never reviewed the county files. They saw water and assumed nuisance. They saw fish and assumed decoration. They never imagined they were looking at infrastructure. The weather forecast that evening caught my attention immediately. 3¼ inches of rain expected over the next 48 hours, with localized downpours possible. The meteorologist even warned about saturated ground from storms earlier that week. Linda looked at the television, then looked at the backyard again. "Should we tell somebody?" she asked softly. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I shook my head. The county already knows how the system works. Carl made his decision without asking anyone. Let's see if he asks now. The first rain arrived overnight, gentle enough that most people probably slept through it. The next morning I noticed something almost immediately. Water sat around the curb drains longer than usual. Small puddles formed at the end of driveways where I'd never seen standing water before. Around lunchtime my neighbor, Ben, walked across the street carrying an umbrella. "You seeing this?" he asked, pointing toward the intersection where water had collected around 2 storm drains. "Never seen that happen." I shrugged. "That's strange." I wasn't lying. It was strange, for people who didn't understand where the water used to go. By late afternoon, neighborhood social media had already filled with photos. Anybody else's street flooding? Storm drain clogged. County maintenance behind schedule? Carl commented confidently that the HOA landscaping contractor would inspect everything in the morning. Reading that almost made me laugh because the problem wasn't in the street. It was buried in my backyard under hundreds of tons of dirt. Then the real rain arrived. Sometime after midnight, thunder shook the windows hard enough to wake both of us. Rain hammered the roof with the steady roar only Midwestern storms can produce, the kind that sounds like gravel pouring from the sky. I walked onto the back porch with a flashlight. Normally my pond would already be collecting runoff through the underground drains. Instead, water slammed into the buried basin, hit compacted fill dirt, and had nowhere to go except back into the drainage network. That's when I knew exactly what sunrise would look like. I wasn't disappointed. By 7 o'clock, streets that had stayed dry for nearly 20 years looked like shallow rivers. Water bubbled upward through overloaded storm drains instead of disappearing into them. Garbage cans floated halfway down Willow Ridge Lane. 3 SUVs stalled trying to drive through intersections that had become temporary ponds. Parents carried children through ankle-deep water to waiting school buses. By noon, the fire department had closed 2 streets because water covered the pavement completely. Around lunchtime, Ben called again, this time sounding worried instead of curious. My basement's taking on water. 20 minutes later, another neighbor posted pictures of soaked carpet. Then another. Within hours, restoration companies started arriving with industrial fans and giant dehumidifiers. Insurance adjusters drove slowly through the subdivision, photographing flooded garages and damaged foundations. The smell changed too. Wet drywall, soaked insulation, mud, gasoline from stalled cars, and that unmistakable scent of panic when people suddenly realize this isn't a temporary inconvenience. This is expensive. Carl still insisted publicly that clogged municipal drains were responsible until one county engineer arrived carrying a thick set of infrastructure maps. I watched from my porch as they walked the streets together. Every few minutes the engineer stopped, pointed at a drawing, then pointed toward my backyard. Carl's posture changed a little more each time. His shoulders lost that confident stiffness. His hands stopped moving. Finally, the engineer removed his hard hat, folded the plans under one arm, and both men simply stood there looking toward my property in complete silence. I didn't need to hear the conversation. I already knew it. Where is the retention basin? Gone. Who authorized its removal? The HOA. Without county approval? Yes. That's usually the moment confidence packs its bags and leaves town. 2 days later, county inspectors arrived with survey crews. They uncovered inspection ports Carl hadn't even known existed beneath landscaping near the sidewalks. They traced every drainage pipe feeding into my former pond. They measured elevations, photographed the buried basin, and documented everything. One inspector actually knocked on my door afterward. "Mr. Collins," he said, "did anyone from the HOA contact you before altering this retention structure?" I answered honestly, "No, sir." He nodded once, wrote something on his clipboard, and quietly said, "I thought so." By the end of that week, the neighborhood looked exhausted. Families carried ruined furniture onto curbs. Children rode bicycles around stacks of drywall, waiting for trash pickup. Mold remediation trucks lined the streets. Hotels filled with displaced homeowners whose insurance covered temporary housing while repairs continued. Ironically, the only basement that stayed completely dry belonged to Linda and me because we'd always understood how the drainage system actually worked. On the 8th morning after my pond disappeared, there was a knock at the front door. Linda opened it first, then stepped aside without saying a word. Carl Whitmore stood there wearing muddy rubber boots, jeans stained halfway to the knees, and a rain jacket that looked like it hadn't dried in days. For the first time since I'd met him, he wasn't carrying a violation notice. He wasn't smiling either. Water dripped from the brim of his cap onto my welcome mat while he looked past me toward the buried pond. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I invited him onto the porch instead of inside. He looked embarrassed enough without making him stand in our living room. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "The county says the flooding." He couldn't even finish the sentence. I helped him. "The flooding started because you buried my retention pond." He nodded. "I didn't know." "No." I replied calmly. "You didn't ask." That sentence hit him harder than any shouting ever could. He rubbed his face with both hands, looked out toward the neighborhood where restoration trucks still moved from house to house, and whispered, "What will it take to fix this?" I walked back into the house, opened the same filing cabinet, and returned carrying another folder, this one much thicker than the first. Carl looked at it, then at me. "What's that?" I smiled politely. "Everything you should have asked for before you buried 18 years of my life." I placed the folder in his hands and watched him open the first page, then the second, then the third, and by the time he reached the restoration proposal, the engineering reports, the ecological assessments, the estimated value of mature koi, documented labor hours spanning nearly 2 decades, replacement costs for established aquatic plants, landscape restoration plans, and legal opinions regarding unauthorized destruction of permitted stormwater infrastructure. The color had almost completely disappeared from his face. He looked back up at me with tired eyes and quietly asked, "Is there any room to negotiate?" I leaned against the porch railing, listened to water dripping steadily from the gutters that once drained harmlessly into my pond, and answered with the calmest voice I'd used all week. "There was 8 days ago." Carl didn't argue after that. For the first time since I'd known him, the man who always had an answer, always had another rule, another committee meeting, another paragraph from the HOA handbook, simply closed the folder and stared at the ground. "If I sign this," he finally asked, "will you help us restore the drainage system?" I looked across the neighborhood where industrial fans hummed inside open garage doors, dumpsters overflowed with ruined drywall, and families who had done absolutely nothing wrong were paying the price for one man's need to control everything around him. That's the part people still misunderstand whenever I tell this story. I never wanted my neighbors to suffer. Ben had always waved when I walked the dog. Mrs. Alvarez brought Linda homemade cookies every Christmas. The young couple across the street had spent months saving for their first house. They weren't my enemies. They were simply trusting the wrong person to make decisions on their behalf. "I'll help," I said, "the minute my pond is restored the right way, not patched together, not made cheaper, restored exactly as it was supposed to be." Carl nodded without another word. 3 days later, the emergency HOA meeting looked nothing like the polished gatherings I'd attended over the years. Residents filled every chair, people stood along the walls, insurance adjusters sat in the back taking notes, county engineers spread drawings across folding tables, and attorneys whispered to clients while everyone waited for the board to explain how one unauthorized decision had turned a quiet subdivision into a construction zone. Carl stood up, cleared his throat, and admitted everything. He acknowledged that no county approval had been obtained, no engineering review had been requested, and no permission had ever been given by the property owner before heavy equipment entered my yard. You could almost feel the room changing as people realized the flood wasn't an unavoidable act of nature. It was the result of arrogance wrapped in authority. The board voted that night to approve every condition in my restoration agreement. They agreed to fully excavate the buried basin, rebuild the filtration system using upgraded equipment, replace every mature koi with fish of equal quality and size, restore the surrounding landscape, compensate us for the destroyed ecosystem, cover all legal expenses connected to the unauthorized work, and establish a permanent policy requiring independent engineering review before any future drainage or environmental feature could ever be modified inside the community. Excavation started the following Monday. Watching those machines remove the very dirt they had dumped there only days earlier felt strangely satisfying. Not because I enjoyed seeing anyone embarrassed, but because every bucket of soil uncovered another piece of something built with patience instead of ego. Workers recovered crushed pipe sections, broken filter housings, shattered stone edging, and even one of Emma's little painted rocks she'd hidden beside the waterfall years earlier. Linda washed it off, smiled through tears, and quietly placed it on the porch until the pond was finished again. The reconstruction lasted almost a month. County engineers supervised every phase. Landscape specialists transplanted mature aquatic plants from certified nurseries. A professional koi breeder helped us select healthy fish that would eventually grow into the kind of graceful giants we had lost. They even redesigned the retention chamber beneath the pond with additional overflow capacity, making the entire drainage system stronger than it had ever been before. The first evening water finally flowed over the rebuilt waterfall. Linda slipped her hand into mine exactly the way she had 18 years earlier when we'd finished the original pond. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. Sometimes the sound of moving water says everything words cannot. Carl resigned as HOA president 2 weeks later. I haven't spoken to him much since then except for a brief conversation at the community mailbox several months afterward. He looked older, quieter somehow. Before walking away he stopped, looked back at me, and said, "I thought I was protecting property values." I answered, "You would've, if you'd protected the property first." He gave a tired little laugh, nodded once, and kept walking. Maybe that was the closest thing either of us would ever get to an apology. These days my grandson is old enough to toss fish food into the pond by himself. He still laughs every time the koi race toward the surface, and every spring the dragonflies come back like they never left. The neighborhood stays dry during heavy storms again, although now everyone knows exactly where the water goes and why that little pond matters so much. Funny how people rarely notice something quietly doing its job until someone destroys it. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about a pond. It was about what happens when power replaces curiosity, when someone decides they already know enough and stops asking questions. Nature has a way of keeping score, and engineering doesn't care about opinions. Water will always find the path it was designed to follow, whether people respect it or not. I never flooded the neighborhood. I never touched a single storm drain or blocked a single pipe. I simply watched the consequences of one careless decision unfold exactly the way physics said they would. Some people still insist I should have warned everyone before the rain came. Others tell me Carl needed to learn that lesson the hard way because he never listened to anyone until reality forced him to. I've heard both sides for years, and maybe that's why this story still gets people arguing every time it comes up. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been standing where I stood, looking at 18 years of memories buried under fresh dirt, would you have warned the neighborhood before the storm arrived? Or would you have let the people responsible discover the truth on their own? Tell me your answer down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between forgiveness, accountability, and justice. And if you enjoy true stories about HOA abuse, property rights, and ordinary people standing up to abuse of power, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes every rule deserves one very important question. Does it actually make sense?